Well, hey everyone. Thank you so much for coming back to the Babcock for our third entry in our Friedkin series. This week we're looking at 1980's Cruising, which was his first film after sort of the disappointment of Sorcerer. I'm joined again with our friend Lincoln Sevier, our
Hey,
expert
everybody.
on William Friedkin. And yeah, Lincoln, what can you tell us about Cruising?
I'm very excited to talk about this film. We'll get into the weeds of it afterwards, but the little story I want to cue up as we go into the movie. A year earlier in 1979, a New York man named Paul Bateson gets arrested for murder. He met another man at a gay club, took the guy to a hotel, got incredibly drunk, and killed him for about $57. He got like blackout drunk and barely remembered the crime. Friedkin was fascinated by this because he knew Paul Bateson. Paul Bateson was actually worked in the radiology department at a New York hospital. And when Friedkin was making The Exorcist, there's a fantastic scene where a really invasive procedure is being performed on young Regan. And Friedkin decided instead of hiring actors to perform this procedure, he'd get the real people. And Paul Bateson was one of the technicians that you can see in that scene. So the fact that this man that Friedkin knew that had been in one of his films turned out to be a killer fascinated Friedkin. He went to visit the guy in jail, and the guy talked about how he barely remembered the crime and that the police had come to him with 8 or 9 other murders and wanted him to confess to them. And Friedkin asked him, "Well, did you kill those other men?" And Paul Bateson said, "I don't know. Maybe." And that notion of nobody being certain whether there's one killer or multiple killers, including the killer themselves, was a fascinating notion for him, and he crafted this story around that concept. So I hope you guys enjoy Cruising. It's a very controversial, maybe his most controversial film, and we can get into why after the film.
Without further ado, let's get into Cruising. All right, we are back, and that was Cruising.
Yes, that movie. This is the third time I've watched that film in a year and a half, and every time I watch it, it reveals itself more and more to me.
So this is my first viewing of it, and well, first, this is Friedkin's first big writing credit was on Cruising. This kind of felt a little bit more like a Brian De Palma film to me.
Interesting.
That psychosexual nature of the story and the unknown killers, it really felt a lot like De Palma's earlier films like Sisters and Obsession. I don't know if that was conscious or not, but it felt like he was maybe feeling a little less sure of himself and was started channeling
Sure.
a more successful artist.
I agree that it has Brian De Palma vibes. Now, Dress to Kill, of course, came later. So even
Yeah.
though it has that psychosexual thing of Dress to Kill, if anything, Dress to Kill owes to Cruising. I think that the big difference between The Sorcerer and this movie is you can tell that he no longer has the money. He no longer has, the big backing of a studio that has full faith in him. I think instead of being able to have a grand film shown in an exotic location, he says, I have to find my location without the benefit of the backing. This gay scene, which was a very small subsect of the gay community in New York, this BDSM leather enthusiasts, was a scene that he had learned about through one of the detectives that the French Connection was based on, was a kind of a consultant. And one of the stories he told him was going undercover at these BDSM gay bars. And Friedkin wanted to see it for himself. And he discovered that it was actually very hard for him to be able to get into one of these bars because it's a very protected community. It's not something that you can just flaunt out into the world because the squares will have you shut down. So he gets a glimpse of this world, says, what a great backdrop for this murder mystery story. So he works on the script, and it starts to get out that William Friedkin is doing another story about gay men. He did one called The Boys in the Band about a gay culture, and he got a lot of grief for it because he's a straight man. And now here he comes again, and he's telling this extreme version of the homosexual experience that 90% of homosexuals it doesn't apply to. And it ended up being a big problem for him because this was during a time in New York culture where gay people were trying to achieve normalcy. They were trying to show the world that they're just like everyone else, they're not dangerous to be around. And along comes Friedkin, who wants to show this subsect of the culture. And there were leaders in the gay community who said, this is a terrible mistake. This film is going to set us back. It's going to justify homophobia. It's going to justify violence against gay men. And we need to stop it. So there's a whole coalition of people who are setting out to stop the making of this movie. Protesters would arrive at the location of that filming and bang pots and pans and scream and make a scene to try to ruin the takes. And that's why, if you noticed in this film, most of the audio was ADR.
Dinner time, I only eat seafood. I gotta watch myself or I balloon up like Shelley Winters. It's worse when I'm working on something. I hope my typing didn't bother you.
What are you working on?
I'm trying to finish a play.
Oh, yeah? What kind of play?
I was thrown by it a little bit, but at the same time, it kind of worked for me, especially since one of the first scenes we see is a murder, and the way that the murderer's voice felt detached from himself almost kind of leaned more into this guy's identity is kind of unknown.
Yeah, you're right. It has a surreal aspect to it, but that was certainly not by design. That was out of necessity. When it was finally released, the reason people came to it is because they'd been reading about this controversial homophobic film. People came to the audience and they found that it didn't blow their hair back. It wasn't worth all the hype. And this film kind of went away as soon as it arrived, mostly panned by critics. A modern audience watches this film and knows that that's not the predominant experience of gay people in New York. But at the time, that wasn't so clear. And there was a lot more homophobia.
I feel like other films like Silence of the Lambs or Dressed to Kill or something sometimes gets a little bit more of a bad rap because of singling out the homosexual characters as the arbiters of violence. And this,
Yeah.
it's like, well, this is a big community, and within that community there are killers, but it's not singling anyone out.
Yeah, it's not singling anyone out. But the other thing that he did in this movie that really interests me, he played with your ability to memorize faces. You know, the reason Pacino was brought into this world as a cop was that he resembled the victims. And they said this killer goes after a type. You fit that type, so go into this world. And with all of these men of similar builds and kind of similar hair color and similar look, I found myself a little confused about who the killer was. During the second killing that takes place in the park, I think, okay, yeah, that's okay. I think this guy's the killer. And then he gets killed. And I was like, oh, wait, was the other guy the killer? And then in the third killing, the killer, who you only see for a brief moment, was actually the actor that played the victim in the hotel room scene. I just thought that I was having a hard time remembering faces, but he does this thing where he keeps you constantly uncertain of who's the killer. And when we're finally on the trail of the university student, I remember thinking, well, he doesn't look like the guys that I saw doing the killing. And so when they finally have that confrontation at the end, and at the same time they both pull out their knives and Pacino stabs the guy, on my third time watching this, I realized I don't know if that guy was the killer at all. Because if anything, you know, he had a knife just like Pacino had a knife, and he was afraid. And I'm not entirely certain they found the right guy.
Yeah, I know kind of one of the big things with this film is the ambiguity as to it could be anyone, including Al Pacino. The end reveal with Karen Allen finding the hat and the sunglasses, that also the death of his neighbor from the apartment complex, but also the detail that I caught that really points to him was the little rhyme that he did.
Who's here? I'm here. You're here.
But I don't know if that was ever discussed in the files of that being said.
No, one of the trans women that was being heckled in the beginning says to, I think, Paul Sorvino's character,
Yeah, nursery rhyme like, who's here, we're here, something like that.
so one could hypothetically say, oh, okay, Pacino learned about it because this other cop had been informed that that was a rhyme, but we don't witness him hearing that. We don't witness that communication taking place. So yeah, there's another possibility that that was him. An interesting story about that. It wasn't until he saw the film in the theater when it ends on that close up of him and the girl putting on the uniform, and then it has that enigmatic tugboat kind of moving across the water. Al Pacino confronts Friedkin and says, it seems like you're implying that I might have been the murderer. And Freakin was like, "Oh yeah, it was just an idea. I had an editorial." And Al Pacino was pissed because he said, "You didn't tell me that. I would change my performance to accommodate that possibility, but you were keeping me out of the loop." Pacino was so pissed about the idea that he was being kept out of the loop about aspects of his own character that he refused to do any press for this film. So this kind of crash and burned their relationship as well.
What is your take? Do you think Al Pacino was the killer or a killer?
No, I don't think so. I think he wanted to create the uncertainty. And he achieves that in a lot of nuanced little ways. One of the ones I don't remember from my first two viewings is at the end when they have apprehended the killer and he's in the hospital. We cut to a shot of the nightclub at night and a man walking across the road to go into the nightclub. And we only see the man from behind, but he looks like the man that we've been seeing that's been doing these killings. And that's the only shot you see. So that's a moment to create that uncertainty.
The only thing that kind of pushed me to Pacino was the death of the neighbor. When he first meets him, it's kind of established that that neighbor doesn't go cruising. He kind of sticks to himself. If that guy doesn't go cruising, how did he meet the killer?
Right.
I love the ambiguity of it. I love that it's up for discussions like this.
Yeah. Once I saw that that was by design, I really started to admire it. I think he was interested by that uncertainty.
Yeah.
He wanted to depict that. But I think as an audience, when we go see a murder mystery, we want to know who done it. We want to have like a resolution, the usual suspects, a big reveal that has us, oh, understand, and all the puzzle pieces suddenly fit. And for him to make this film that ends with Pacino shaving and looking at himself in the mirror on a tugboat, it didn't give audiences any of the answers they were looking for. So I think that the ambiguity in this film, along with him not having his finger on the pulse of gay culture, were two things that really worked against him with audiences in this movie.
Another thing I really loved about this film is the color palette. We see a lot of deep blues and blacks in this, which of course kind of alludes to the blue and black of the New York City police uniform. I love how that is just saturated throughout this whole thing. I also really like the title Cruising. I think cruising is that great double entendre, of course, as we learn in the film, of cruising as in men looking to hook up with other men, but also cruising is how police officers will describe being out on patrol.
That's interesting. The film opens with a couple cops cruising out on patrol, and you see them as cops, and they pull over these two young trans women and force themselves on them. And when one of the trans women goes to Paul Sorvino's character and says, "Hey, you got to help me out. A couple of your cops made me go down on him." Paul Sorvino, he doesn't say, "I don't believe you." He says, "Give me their names and badges. There's people out there that fake it. I don't know if these are real cops," but he doesn't dismiss it out of hand. He says, "I need proof. If you're going to pull something like that, I need proof." And that idea of not even knowing, I think we as an audience know that they're cops. This confusion of who's real and who's fake kind of adds to that whole theme. One moment that comes to mind that was one of my all-time favorite moments, inexplicable moments, Al Pacino, who they're trying to do the sting, and they come in too early because of the radio program, and they get taken in, and Al Pacino and the other guy are getting interrogated by the cops. And then the door opens, and this big black man in a jockstrap and a cowboy hat walks in and smacks Pacino. Like it's the most outrageous moment. And what I learned is it's one of those rich details that Friedkin puts into one of his films, which is if cops are going to rough someone up, and they don't want that person's testimony believable, they will try to pull something that nobody would believe, aka a big man in a jockstrap and a cowboy hat came in and he started hitting me. It would have a hard time holding up in court. So apparently that was the idea, but he offers no explanation for that.
I appreciate that description because I was also very confused at what just happened there.
What was that?
Go back to the room. What'd he hit me for?
A couple great little appearances by secondary characters. Did you notice Ed O'Neill was one of the cops that
I
went to the
noticed Ed
restaurant?
O'Neill. I also noticed one of the cops that were cruising at the beginning is the guy from Dumb and Dumber that chokes on the hot pepper burger.
Yep. The other cop is named Joe Spinell. He was one of the assassins during the killing of the five families in The Godfather. We see him for just a moment, but he's got a very memorable face.
Joe Spinell also was the titular maniac in 1980's Maniac, which was same year, so it's kind of interesting. Probably not too far off in theaters. He was also playing a crazed killer.
Oh, one last tidbit that I heard is when they fished a body part out of the river in the beginning, William Friedkin went to the New York coroner and wanted to shoot at that location. He convinced the guy to let him shoot some real body parts. And so all of those body parts that are on that tray are real human remains. The coroner got busted for it and fired because he allowed this unsanctioned thing to happen in this film. One of the scenes I really admired is the ending where Pacino is confronting the person that, as an audience, we want to believe is the killer. But there's a great exchange that feels like it kind of embraced all of the nuances of the sexual culture, where the guy says to Pacino,
How big are you?
Party size.
What are you into?
I go anywhere.
I don't do anything.
That's cool. Hips or lips.
That whole exchange felt like something that could only have come from interviews and conversations and learning the lingo and whatever. And I like how one would say, I don't do anything. To which Pacino would say, that's cool. Like, if you're into that, if you're into not making effort, that's cool. And at the same time, I can see how that would be among the things that would receive the most criticism about this. It's like, yo, this isn't your world, man. Like, stay out of it. He makes the film with all of the controversy. It goes out into the world and it flops. It flops just as bad as The Sorcerer. The difference being with The Sorcerer, there were high expectations. With this one, it was infamous before it ever came out. And it became that much harder after this to make a film. You know, I wish I could be at the theater because as a straight viewer, I watch this and I say, this is not the controversial film it once was. I don't see this as a homophobic movie. I see it as maybe a misguided perspective, but I am curious what audiences think about this controversial films. He followed this up with a comedy, a Chevy Chase comedy called Deal of the Century, which I enjoyed, but it was even less substantial than this one. And by the time he made To Live and Die in LA, I would say it was safe to say there was no longer any expectations about William Friedkin. Like he had thoroughly bottomed out. And so his next film that we're going to watch together, To Live and Die in LA, which feels like a big budget film, was actually very small budget because once again, he didn't have much money working for him, but a real return to form for him and what I would call his like great 80s masterpiece. It is a frickin' cool cop movie. Willem Dafoe is at his all-time best. He's probably in his late 20s in this movie. This movie's it's just electric and it's really fun. I'm surprised that it's not better known than it is, but it's a real gem and I think people will enjoy it.
Yeah, so join us for our final installment of our Freakin' with To Live and Die in LA, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.